Good day, everybody. I'm saying good day because it's in the afternoon in New Zealand and in the morning in many other places. Welcome to our webinar. We're just going to wait for a couple of minutes to give people a chance to come into the room, and then we'll get started. If you just wouldn't mind holding on, that'd be great. Thank you very much. Right, I think we should get started because everybody's got time pressures, but a warm welcome everybody to our first GITA Insurtech webinar. For some opening remarks, I just want to hand over briefly to Brenton Charnley, who's going to give you all some background on how we came to this session. Brenton.
Thank you, Kai, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I think wherever you are in the world, I feel like the Truman Show, if anyone can remember this one, part of webinars in today. I've got a simple task today is just give you a bit of background how we came to bring together the Global Insurtech Alliance. And it goes back to April 2017, believe it or not, when I did a trip hosted by George Kesselman, who's on the panel today, around Asia, and we had a great time. I think we went to 5 different countries, and at that time I was launching Insurtech Australia in Australia, and George had founded Insurtech Asia, and we both agreed at that point in time to kind of collaborate, and that was really the kickoff of kind of mutual collaboration across regions. Fast forward to October 2017, we launched Insurtech Australia, and then I believe it was in November that I went over to New Zealand and met Jason and the team over in FinTech NZ. And then not long after that, I did a lot of travel to London and started collaborating with Instech London and Robin Mertens and the team. And it wasn't too long after that, I think it was about 6 or 9 months, that we all came together and agreed that kind of bringing the connectivity of the global ecosystem was going to help us all and help the insurtechs that we represent globally. So as a bit of background how we got here, our mission is to really create and drive forward our global ecosystem. And it was New Zealand, Asia, Australia and London who really came together to bring that. And I'm pleased to say that we now have 13 members in the Alliance. We'll hear from Norbert in Tokyo, but we have other members including New York, Hartford, Israel, Munich, Ireland, Istanbul, Switzerland, Cologne, and a few more in the pipeline that are going to be joining. So it's pleased to see the Global Insurtech Alliance doing exactly what it says, which is to be global. I look forward to hearing a little bit more about the APAC region from the panelists today. So welcome everyone.
Thanks, Brenton. That's great. So in today's session, as Brenton's framed it up, we're going to be listening to some of the developments that are happening in Australia and New Zealand, as well as Japan and Singapore and Southeast Asia. This is the first in a series of events, similar introductory events that other GITA partners are going to be hosting. I believe there's 2 planned, one in Middle East, Europe, the Middle East Europe region, and then for the Americas as well, there's going to be another one. So if you feel interested enough, you can sort of follow the sun, which is the sort of the original concept that was developed for this, and learn about Insurtech all around the world. So with those 13 members, and might I say also mostly scattered across the most important centers for insurance in the world, so you get a pretty comprehensive view. I just want to say first up, before we get started, that during the webinar, please do use the Q&A feature in order to submit questions. We'll be tracking those as we go through, and we hope to get to all of them. I'll repeat that a couple of times through the seminar, the webinar, to remind you, but that'll be really, really helpful and make it really interactive and engaging. So the first thing we want to do right now is to perhaps start off with a quick poll, which should come up, and we'd like you to respond to the questions on that poll. And while you're doing that, I'll just frame up maybe where we're at. You know, Insurtech What is InsurTech? It's the use of technology innovations that are designed to make the current insurance model more efficient and to deliver better outcomes for customers. In a nutshell, it tends to cover those two things: efficiency and great customer outcomes. And although technology innovation has been around for decades, I've got a lot of gray hairs, I've been in the industry a long time. InsurTech as a label on what technology does in insurance really sort of started appearing around 2010, when there was a massive uplift in the focus on technology and the insurance industry and its very traditional practices. Contrary to some views, InsurTech is not just about disruption. All InsurTechs are not there to disrupt everybody. It's as relevant to long-established insurance providers as it is to the startups and all other organizations that are actually part of the insurance value chain. And so, just to reiterate what Brenton put into the frame before, we're really about the entire insurance ecosystem, and we welcome all of those participants and those who have an interest in the insurance industry and how it's developed. Now, before we get into the heart of the webinar, I also wanted to just summarize some points in the interests of maximizing the use of our 1 hour of time, the background of COVID-19, because otherwise we'd have each of our panelists probably repeating some of the same kind of comments. So we did a quick chat a couple of weeks ago, and I'm gonna basically summarize where things stand as a result of COVID-19. So it's not possible to avoid talking about it right now, but as far as InsurTech's concerned, COVID has had a consistent impact across most markets. And the really positives out of that is that it's increased the urgency that has been felt around digitization and changing the way of work. And we've actually got examples as well where COVID-19 accelerated the development of markets, products into market and investments in ventures. But we've also seen for earlier startup ventures, I think, a slowdown in that environment. So it's rather like Charles Dickens said, it's the best of times and the worst of times. So the investment climate has dried up. And in fact, in January, InsurTech Worldwide still had a $450 million investment in about 9 or 10 ventures from around the world, and that dried up by March to about only $45 million. So there's in January we were just hearing about this new coronavirus. By March we were in full scale self-isolation and withdrawal mode. So there you see, I think, a couple of numbers that help you understand that in terms of context. And the other thing that has been a real challenge for, as a result of COVID-19, has been the self-isolation and the travel restrictions. And that's largely because new ventures have short runways, limited investment. And so anything that prevents them from forging partnerships and collaboration is a challenge and means they have to review carefully their roadmap and their development plans. So those are the kind of outcomes that are being felt all across the region. But notwithstanding that, I don't think it's done anything to impair the general level of optimism and excitement about the ability to change insurance for the good. So that's by way of background in terms of COVID-19 and how it's impacting the members of our organizations across Asia Pacific. But now I'd like to launch straight into, I guess we'll start with Japan, a discussion on what is the situation in your local market and what's particularly interesting in the InsurTech space. So Norbert, if you'd like to kick off that, and we'll go around each of the regions and hopefully people can learn from that.
Wonderful, thank you, Kai. So Tokyo FinTech was created in 2017 under the very basic premise, and I've got the gray hair to show it as well. If you transform and innovate in a big organization, one of the essential obstacles and challenges that you face is to scale learning. And so if you can't scale the learning aspect and make people understand new technologies, new business processes, then you're invariably going to fail. So first of all, unlike many other participants, we understand FinTech as part of Tokyo FinTech as broadly covering the whole financial services sector. So that's banking, insurance, capital markets, payments, and the enabling technologies. So we feel quite honored to be part of GITA and our more insurance-focused colleagues. And secondly, we don't have a mandate, and we've never attempted to try to influence policy. So we're really here to build a community from the ground up to enable people to get exposure to new technologies and to share that with as many people as we can. In terms of the Tokyo market, it is, or the Japanese market overall, it's obviously the third largest economy in the world. It's actually the largest life insurance market in the world. And if you look at Tokyo metropolitan area, notwithstanding the fellow panelists here, but the Tokyo metropolitan area in terms of population is as big as Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore combined. And on its own, it would be a top 20 economy globally. The challenges that we have in this market is the declining population, it's an aging population. Most of the wealth is tied up with people 60 years old and older. In a shrinking market like this, many of the insurance players are looking at markets abroad. So first of all, you have a concentration in 3 major insurers who have 85% of the market share. And then these have generated now also quite significant revenue abroad. So you see Tokyo Fire Marine at 50%, Sompo at probably a bit lower at 30. So arguably they are very international companies in some shape or form. It is a market pre-COVID that's very much based on personal interaction. So it's a highly intermediate market. 90% of the insurance gets sold through agents. And also from a technology perspective, the fax machine is very dominant, especially in the rural areas. So when we talk about innovation, the first step really is that we need to digitize. And before we digitalize, or you can make an argument, you could actually leapfrog one stage and go beyond that. There is, especially in the life insurance sector, after now 20 years of stable prices and deflation, obviously some challenges in generating revenue and profitability. So you see many of the insurers going out into ancillary businesses. So that would be retirement homes, cybersecurity, etc. So when we look also at InsurTech in that context, we look relatively broad. Lastly, the Tokyo Metropolitan Government has, for the last 2 years, had an annual award. It's called the Tokyo Financial Award, and it's meant to address the needs of the Tokyo citizens. And interestingly enough, the 2 winners, and it's a small sample size, of course, but the 2 winners in 19 and 20 were both peer-to-peer insurance companies. So you can take this as a sign that there is a need for innovation, for better products to serve the customers. So I hand it back to you, Kai. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. That's great, Norbert. I think I've heard of the Tokyo Financial Award. It's quite an attractive prize, I believe, that they offer.
It's $10,000, I think. So it's $1 million yen for the winner. Yes.
$1 million yen sounds like a hell of a lot more. So, George, now let's switch to you. I mean, you probably can speak on behalf of, I won't try and preempt you too much, but the most diverse region amongst our 4 panelists here.
Thanks, Kai. Yeah, I appreciate the chance to come together. I think this has really been an exciting time for the region. And yeah, we've started InsurTech Asia in 2016, and it's really been growing. And when we first started, it was really like early days, like you said, 2010 when it was first started as an InsurTech concept. But overall, I think the awareness of InsurTech hasn't really picked up until about 2016, where it's really been something that has been a lot more on top of minds for a lot of people. So as InsurTech Asia, we started as an association to really bring everybody together around the region. We're HQ'd in Singapore, and the big focus for us is still across Southeast Asia, because there are so many markets just in the vicinity here, and Southeast Asia itself is a fairly fragmented market. So we've been focusing a lot on bridging these markets together, focusing on the education components, focusing on the awareness components, and really driving that collaboration. Like what Brenton was saying is one of the initiatives that we did, and that's been very well received, has been that roadshow where we did 5 days in 5 countries. We brought startups across all these markets together, and that's been a very well received both from the insurers as well as the startups. We've seen a lot of the collaboration come out from this type of models, where it is, I guess, still a very face-to-face interaction markets. And as we see that developing further, I think there is going to be a lot more opportunities as all these markets come together. So in terms of the region overall, I think challenges and opportunities is, Southeast Asia and Asia markets are fairly fragmented, and there's quite a variety of different stages of the development. So we have markets like Singapore, which is highly advanced and developed, and other markets are in the various stages of development across the region, which creates a challenges of scalability. So for a lot of the startups that have started in one market, they are always looking at how do they expand it to the next market, how do they grow into something that is a much larger scale and call across. And that's been really where we've found that education of the regulators, education of the insurers, alignment of the different countries has been a big focus for us. And also together with that, I guess the other focus has been in terms of educating the insurers. Still 90+% of the region is still using intermediaries as their primary distribution mechanism. So that's been, we see it again as a challenge and an opportunity altogether, because it is still a fairly traditional ways of doing business in Southeast Asia, but there's a lot of pent-up demand for digital as well. So yes, we're thankfully we're not as in the stage of fax machines, so we're a little bit ahead of it. But we look at there's other markets like China, which is just leapfrogging ahead, miles and miles ahead. Where Southeast Asia is probably somewhere in between as well.
Great. And Southeast Asia, of course, is lots of different markets. So in some you'll have very high penetration, in others you'll have very minimal penetration, right?
Absolutely right.
Yeah. So thanks for that, George. I'm sure that'll prompt a few more questions, which we'll get to later on. Rita, do you want to talk a little bit about Australia and what's happening there?
Sure, thanks, Kai. And it is really great to be here today, the very first ever GITA event. So it's great that the APAC region could get that happening, and looking forward to many more. So I thought I'd just start with a super quick snapshot of the insurance landscape more broadly here in Australia. So financial services and insurance really captures around 10% of the gross economic value in Australia. So it is a very large segment, and it employs about 3.6% of people across Australia as well. In terms of general insurance, there are 4 main players that capture the majority of the market there in terms of market share, which is similar to some of the other regions I know. And that's anywhere between 55 and 75% depending on the segment that you're looking at specifically. Switching to life insurance is a little bit more evenly spread, the market share across the top 10 main players, and the top 10 account for about 95% of the market here. So if we look at more broadly the startup ecosystem here in Australia, I actually came across the Startup Blink ecosystem report that came out last week. It's an annual report that looks at the top 100 companies and rates them in terms of their startup ecosystems. And Australia actually ranked 7th this year, which was actually, you know, not super surprising to me, but it was really good to see that. And I think we were the highest rated out of all of the APAC countries. So we do have a fairly supportive startup ecosystem, more broadly speaking, and very supportive of tech and innovation. So switching now to Insurtech Australia more specifically, and the Insurtech ecosystem here in Australia. I think Brenton mentioned from the beginning that we were established in 2017. And around that time, I think similar to George, it was just around the time when Insurtech as a potential industry started really gaining a lot more momentum and interest here in Australia, both from the startup ecosystem as well as the insurance ecosystem. So we were established as an organisation, and initially we had about 10 corporate partners come on board as founding partners. So we were very lucky to have incumbent support from day one. We had a handful of Insurtech members, so not a huge amount of members at that point in time that represented startups and scale-ups. And we have grown over the last couple of years to the point where we now have 65 Insurtech members, startups and scale-ups, operating right across the value chain. And we have around about 10% of those are international Insurtechs scaling into the Australian region as well. And on the flip side, we have 24 corporate incumbent partners. So they come from insurers, broking firms, legal firms, consulting firms, and others that operate across the insurance value chain or provide services to insurance more broadly. So obviously we've experienced quite a bit of growth over that period of time. Ultimately, our goals is, or our first and foremost, our goal is to create a world-leading Insurtech ecosystem here in Australia. And a lot of that is about not only supporting the number of Insurtechs and the scale of Insurtechs in the region, but it's also supporting the incumbents and their digital and innovation strategies that they have, and then providing the connections in between the two. So all of our initiatives really focus on three main things, which is advocate, educate, and facilitate, and providing connections between those within our ecosystem for some sort of mutual benefit. So we started out in 2017 as a division of FinTech Australia. So, you know, that made sense at the time when we had a very small number of Insurtechs operating in Australia, and broadly speaking, you know, similar to Japan and similar to Asia and other regions, we saw ourselves as a part of FinTech. But during the last few years, particularly driven by the growth that we've experienced, but also driven by the fact that our objectives within our ecosystem are quite different to the FinTech ecosystem in Australia, which is a lot more disruptive. You know, if you think about the neobanks starting to operate in this region here, Insurtech is very much more a collaborative ecosystem. So last June, we became an independent organisation separate to FinTech Australia, with our own objectives, our own board, and our own governance structure, which has been really positive. We'll also next month see the release of our third Insurtech ecosystem report across Australia, which we put together each year with EY. It's a really good snapshot and provides a lot of really great statistics about the status of maturation of partnerships across the region, the number of Insurtechs operating in this region and where they're playing along the value chain, amongst a whole host of other things, and provides an ecosystem map placing all of those Insurtechs at various points along the value chain, I should say. And so finally, I'll just mention as well, and Brenton's already mentioned this, we were one of the founding members of the Global Insurtech Alliance, and see that as being really important, particularly to our members. So global connectedness is a key objective for us to support our members with. And part of the reason for that is Australia is relatively quite a small market. So most Insurtechs here in Australia are looking to develop their propositions as being global propositions from day one, and do have the goal of scaling internationally at some point along their journey. So it is really great to be a part of this group, and I'm looking forward to seeing us do more together in the future.
Great, thanks Rita. There is actually a question that's come in, which I'll get to right now because it's related to what you just mentioned, and that is, can you confirm a link to the name of the report that you just referenced? So perhaps you can respond to that in the Q&A, that'd be great, and then everybody can see it. So let's go to Aotearoa, New Zealand. Jason, well, welcome to you as well. If you want to tell us a little bit about the InsurTech scene here in New Zealand.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you for inviting us all, and it's obviously this collaboration getting kicked off out of touch. It's fantastic. Look, why don't I just quickly start on the foundations of InsurTech and just link it through to a marketplace here, and then I'll just come back to where we're at. So InsurTech New Zealand is actually an offshoot of, a working group of FinTech New Zealand, which is a member group under the NZ Alliance. And so for us, FinTech is very important as a part of our parent group and part of our parent base. And also given that many of our insurers and bankers and all across the overarching financial services sector often tend to be intertwined and linked. So it makes sense to us for a smaller country to work together and collaborate in that way to leverage opportunity. New Zealand isn't called, it is called the Shaky Islands for a reason, which is the fact that we're part of the Ring of Fire, and we have this problem with earthquakes and volcanoes and all sorts of things. So this has led to a country that has started its insurance world very much motivated by looking after its citizens, and to some extent led to the growth of some larger public institutions. We call them Accident Compensation Earthquake Commission, and that actually helps us address bigger areas. And behind that, we've had then the insurers have come in various areas over time of domestic insurance, business insurance, and so on. So our market has got the strong influence from the government sort of public sector that's helped form our foundations. And then, of course, over time, we've had the influence of often international companies who have managed to exert quite a lot of influence over the New Zealand marketplace. So within New Zealand, whilst we have a pretty strong local insurance-owned marketplace, we do tend to live within the context of the bigger players overseas who pretty much really mean that the services they provide tend to be not quite made in New Zealand for New Zealand. So that's a strong focus of where InsurTech has also started to think about what it needs. So how do we get services made for our market in New Zealand? Somebody mentioned before about the disintermediated market. Well, we're probably less reliant on the disintermediated market now. It's changing as insurers become more powerful about direct services to their own customers, and the rise of digital services, which is improving some aspects. So we are quite, I think, compared with fax machine comments, I think New Zealand, to some extent, even maybe along with Australia, we're perhaps more advanced around digital processes and how that's really accelerated services to our customers. Having said that, of course, there's some big drivers for InsurTech. That's around usually customer experience, the real need to digitize more and to really provide a more seamless experience, to try and get that across the claims value chain, across all points of contact, so there's no single point touches, and also back-end processes, which obviously is such a driver. So we have our challenges like so many markets. I would say primarily for us, it's the smaller market. I mean, we're the minnow of this group here today, and that has its own challenges around funding, which I'm sure we'll get to later on. Just like most of you here, we've been around this in an InsurTech group since 2017 as well, I believe, and grown really focused on how do we improve customer experience, how do we add value to our members, primarily a mix of InsurTechs, incumbents, NZ tech providers, investors, and to some extent the regulators, who we've been very fortunate to have quite a strong relationship with. And to that extent, you know, our relationships with our regulators tend to be more guided by what we should do as opposed to what they shall do. And that's been beneficial for us in terms of guiding and developing services. But more recently, we've been under the spotlight, perhaps like many countries around the world, with whether or not we're really looking after our customers enough. And that's led to some investigation around life insurance, making sure that you know, it's not too much stacked in the favour of the life insurer, and things like capital investment and so on. So we've got our challenges, but ultimately as a member group, we really want to help our very active and interested insurtechs and innovators to reach out and get outside of New Zealand, because we are fundamentally an export-driven company. And of our 3 top earners, which is agriculture that many of you know about, tourism was number 2, unfortunately taking a real big hit now, and tech, NZ Tech, technology is number 3, within which FinTech's a very important part. So we obviously have a really strong focus on accelerating tech innovation. I think it's probably enough for now, given that the clock's ticking, and we'll hand back to you, Kai.
Thanks, Jason. And, while you're there, getting a bit of an echo, but it's gone now. There is a question for you, which is might just as well deal with it straight away. What do you think is driving the uptake by customers of a direct offering in New Zealand, as this isn't occurring to the same extent in Australia? So if you want to have a go at that.
I think it's probably to do with customer expectation. I think we've benefited from contactless transacting and all sorts of digital experiences that now customers are asking more of. And I'm sure that's a trend we'll see even more of as we get more used to our mobile devices ruling our lives.
Yeah, I think it's also a difference between commercial and personal insurance, of course, isn't it?
Of course.
Yeah, yeah. So thanks everybody. That's great, and we're getting some questions come in. Rita, a couple of people asking about that report, so I think if we can distribute that, that would be brilliant. The link to that report.
We'll just pop that into the chat group shortly, Kai.
Yep.
So
fantastic. Now here's a great one from Ron. Insurtech often involves many regulatory requirements. These requirements and the ability of the insurtech to comply often worries potential corporate partners. How can this group help early stage businesses navigate these challenges, and should this group be challenging regulators so the legislative settings don't inadvertently stymie innovation? I'm going to actually throw that first. I think that's worth everybody having maybe a go at, but Rita, because I know Australia's had such an incredible focus from regulators recently, maybe you want to comment on that, because I had the same question as well. How do insurtechs cope with the fact that the incumbents who they want to collaborate with are so under the gun right now?
Yeah, look, it's a difficult one, and I think our market in particular has experienced such a great deal of focus on regulation, some of which changes have been held off for a period of time going through this current crisis. It's also a difficult one because we have previously delved into policy advocacy and policy support and attempted to really make change in that way, and it has proved very difficult. And I think, as Norbert mentioned as well, it's something that they shy away from in their region more broadly. So whilst we are really open to having regulators as part of our ecosystem, and certainly do have regulators as part of our ecosystem, it's not something that we have the capacity to really drive head on ourselves as an organisation, being completely blunt about it. Because it's just too big and too much to actually handle, to really make headway into it as an organisation. So I think it really takes actually an ecosystem approach, which is why we have built this ecosystem, and we have partners within our ecosystem such as ANZIF, who, Jason, obviously your region is very familiar with, and they play a major role in actually supporting activities around policy advocacy and so forth. So we've aligned ourselves with organisations like that, so that we can drive forwards initiatives through other partners.
Yeah, so Jason, maybe you can comment quickly on, I know Insurtech New Zealand does as much as it can to include and incorporate people like the Financial Markets Authority who regulate market conduct into our discussions. We're not lobbyists, but at the same time, what happens in New Zealand to try and at least create that ecosystem benefit of that participation?
Yeah, I do think collaboration's a really important part. We're kind of lucky in New Zealand. We're small enough to almost be able to pick up the phone or talk to someone at the conference and jack up a meeting. So we have that intimacy of a small marketplace. But I do believe that the influences in our context, we work a lot with the Financial Services Council, which is a major participant in the influence world. Transparency New Zealand, which is often to do with regulation and engagement with the financial services, and then of course the Insurance Council and one or two others. So our ability and even the ability to have staff from FMA come to speak at our events and engage in our working groups. So we've got the fortune of being able to talk personally with folk, but it doesn't necessarily mean we can affect change. But it does help lubricate the wheels and help keep the conversations alive.
Mm. So George, within Insurtech Asia, of course, you've got the challenge of multiple languages, multiple cultures, multiple regulatory systems, multiple tax systems. There's probably only a very limited amount you can actually undertake there, but at the same time, you can't ignore it because it's really relevant still. How does it look from your perspective?
So from our perspective, how we approach it is very much about the education and just being there, working in a collaborative way again with the regulator. So what we've seen is that there's an increase in cases where the regulators are coming to us, trying to understand what's happening, trying to understand what's happening in the other regions as well. So we've been again acting as a bridging entity where sometimes we say to one regulator that they should speak to the other regulator because there's some interesting approaches that they have taken. We've seen, for example, that Singapore has probably been at the forefront of some of the regulatory aspects where they've taken a risk-based approach to regulation, even for the insurtechs, meaning that they just say, if you want to start something, just go ahead and start it because the risk is so small. You should kind of as a both the insurer as well as the startup should be able to assess it. So we've been referencing that to some of the other regulators that we've been speaking to about it, so that they also have an idea of how potentially to reduce the hurdles to the progress in their locations. So I guess, yeah, it's less about like I would say pushing it more rather than more about like an influencing an education process.
Yeah. And Norbert, you've already expressly put regulatory sort of lobbying, influencing as out of scope, probably because it's too hard. Is that right?
Well, lobbying is out of scope, but it doesn't mean we're not talking to the regulators, right? But I think I'll continue a little bit along George's line, because I think regulation and insurance is so super highly regulated. It's unbelievable. I spent most of my career in banking, capital markets, investment banking, and I thought that was bad, but insurance is still worse. And so when you look at a startup, it's not like you can go into the insurance business with very few exceptions, right? For the most part, the startups are insurtech, they are software providers. And I think what we've seen in the general banking markets around the world, we've seen now all these neobanks popping up, virtual banks that are, we've got regulation for across Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan. We've got European neobanks that are very strong. We've got neo brokers. We don't really have many neo insurers, and Singlife is a good example, I think. So the problem with regulation, I think, is we can talk about this for a long time. It comes back a bit to the education part and also being able to try it out. And that's kind of what George said. And so sandboxes, regulatory sandboxes play an important part in that, and there are the different shapes of that across the region. In Japan specifically, on the one hand, we are very lucky because we only have one financial services regulator, that's the FSA, covering all businesses. The unfortunate thing is that the sandbox actually sits above the regulator, it sits underneath the cabinet office, and is meant to really be a cross-industry sandbox, which conceptually is very enticing because now you can combine self-driving cars, insurance, banking, basically in one POC, but the take-up is much more complex and hasn't really succeeded. And I think, again, Singapore is doing a really good job in sandboxing it, providing that ability, being nimble as the regulator to engage with startups that don't have much time, they don't have much runway, so you can't have like a 15 months trial period. It's all a bit punchier. And what they've done now which is, I think it's much more banking focused, is the Asia Financial Innovation Network and the API exchange that they've built, which allows to connect banks across the region with startups from around the world, really. And rather than going in and trying to do a POC and negotiate this for months, within hours or days, you can actually connect and experiment on that platform. And there's no reason that they can't scale it out across insurance or across other regions. I know they're talking in Africa, for example. But I think we need this infrastructure, not to play around, it sounds a bit too silly, but to, in a target-oriented way, experiment and gain lessons learned for anybody who has got a stake in the ecosystem, and that includes the regulators. Right.
And I think I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of all of the InsurTech organizations that there are explicit startups working in RegTech, and I'm sure that they are members of your organizations as well. So let's just shift a little bit here. From the chat, there's a question that I don't want to miss, rather than the Q&A stream. George, keen to get your thoughts on why the Chinese digital ecosystem model hasn't taken up in a big way in other APAC countries. A very interesting question.
Indeed.
Because it is amazing what's happened in China. Yeah.
Absolutely, and we watching it with a lot of awe, and they are leading, I guess, a lot of progressive things in China. I guess the biggest thing that the Chinese market has seen that Southeast Asia has not is that the digital technology really have converged in China, and when you have somebody who is in their 80s going to the market and using WeChat to purchase things, and everything is digital payments, it is just provides that foundational digital adoption to a much higher grade. So even last few days that I'm speaking to our Chinese insurers, it just, they say that technology by itself now is table stakes in China. It's just, yeah. It's been advanced so far, and leapfrogging ahead so much. They say that we're interested in kind of next generation, what's going to come after, where I think Southeast Asia is still on probably a phase one where we say like, okay, digital payments is increasing, but it is still a fairly early adoption of it across the markets. Adoption of mobile is definitely picking up very healthy here, but it's still not used for a lot of the transactional capabilities. So I think as we see, Southeast Asia is definitely converging towards the Chinese model, but it's still not at that kind of a state of maturity, I would say. And that's probably where we see the difference of InsurTech reflecting that.
Yeah, it seems to me that China also almost completely skipped the construction of a legacy insurance industry and went straight to a more modern iteration, which means that they probably have less to overcome. And the second part of that question is actually to all panelists. Maybe you can quickly, Norbert, maybe you can kick us off. Are you seeing any new product propositions being conceptualized for catering to the emerging customer demands in post-COVID world? That might just be a simple yes or no.
Yes, I mean, I think coming back to my introductory comment, the biggest challenge we have is that both at the personal level and the corporate level, you still have a seal here that is registered typically with the government and that you sign your contracts with. And so in a pandemic situation where you don't want anybody come to the office, but you have to physically stamp documents, that's a bit of a challenge. So I think we will see very rapid change. And it's not that the legislation isn't there, it's simply that there has been a resistance to changing the business practices. So companies like DocuSign have been in Japan for 10 years. And the leading solution, of course, is not a Western software company. You have to build a homebrew Japanese product to support it. But I think that is like one area where digitization will take off, even within this year, quite dramatically.
Yeah, yeah. How about Australia, Rita? Is there anybody working on some inspiring solutions post-COVID, whether they be new products or whether they be new technologies to enable products?
Yeah, look, it's not necessarily anything new, but what we have seen is that there has been an absolute increase in uptake on things like virtual tools that are enabling insurers and incumbents to perform different tasks and parts of their role virtually. So that could be assessments of damage, for example. And they've realized actually how quickly it is to implement that type of technology in their business when they actually have to, because they have people isolated and working from home and not able to get out to sites and so forth. So that has certainly been very obvious. I think the other is that there's a lot more discussion now, and it relates back to what we've all talked about around customer demands, but a lot more discussion around things like subscription models for insurance and on-demand insurance and much more flexible insurance options in the future, considering what we've all just been through. And, you know, if you take the example of motor insurance, which has not been used for a period of time by many people because they have been isolated and they've been confined to their homes, it's become obvious to consumers that that doesn't necessarily fit what their requirement is.
Yeah. Okay, great. So just on just while I'm looking at the chat link here, which everybody is able to access, Rita has made the link available to you all on that if you want to have a look at that report that she mentioned earlier. So I've got another question. I'll move on to another question now, and Jason, I'll kick off with you. But all four of you have spoken strongly about how your InsurTech organizations support incumbents. What are the ways in which each of you are doing this? So Jason, do you want to start with that one? You're on mute. Are you on mute, Jason?
Apologies, sorry. Bit of a tricky question, that one. I think, I feel like there's sometimes a gap between the interests of insurtechs and funders and the startup communities at times and those of our incumbents, and how do you collaborate with this mutual interest, and perhaps even New Zealand's market, because of the larger domination of our marketplace by external companies, makes accessibility harder. So for us to engage has been harder at times. Having said that, the way in which we're trying to do that is to collaborate with some of the partners I mentioned before, and also just invite and involve our larger organisations to work with us at a leadership level and our other areas of member engagement. So it's probably more of inclusion. What I do notice is that many of our insurtechs are generally doing really well themselves at engaging in the local market, and that is a really good thing. The one rider to that is that virtually all of our insurtechs, whilst they're augmenting the local market, are actually designing products for export for international purposes, and that's a challenge for our market. Whilst it's important, it can be a barrier at times as well.
Yeah, maybe we'll get to that a little bit later if we have time. How to support scaling up internationally. Rita, I was really impressed with your summary on how you've managed to engage a high number of insurtechs, but also a high number of incumbents, and also kind of embedded it into your mission statement. So how does that work for you guys?
Yeah, we have been very lucky over the years to have such great incumbent support. But the way that we look at it is that our ecosystem relies on the incumbents being involved and playing an active role for the ecosystem to thrive. So I think the figure is about 95% of the insurtechs operating in Australia are enablers. So they're looking to work with and partner with incumbents in some way. So if we only had a group of insurtechs on their own, we probably wouldn't really be making too much of an impact. So in reality, some of the things that we actually do and some of the initiatives that we focus on to continue to get involvement and support the incumbent side is a fewfold. One is obviously on the education front, and that happens at many levels within certain organisations. But then on a broader level, we run a lot of events for our ecosystem. We aim to create connections between the insurtechs and the incumbents, and that could be, you know, on an ad hoc basis, or it could be on a much more sort of specific level. So I guess an example of one of the initiatives that we ran late last year and will do more of in the future is a reverse pitch that we ran for a group of 3 life insurers, where effectively they pitched their problems to an audience of interested insurtechs that potentially could solve those problems. And then the insurtechs in the audience actually applied to each of those, whichever was relevant, problem statements that they could potentially work with and solve. And then that was obviously shortlisted, and it led to more very specific discussions between the incumbents and the insurtechs, as opposed to a random connection or a random meeting. So I guess that's one example of a specific initiative that we have run, but there's obviously a big focus for us on making sure that all of our initiatives also support the incumbents within our ecosystem as well as the insurtechs.
That's terrific. George, I understand in Singapore that's done a lot as well, where, and I think the Tokyo FinTech award that you mentioned before, Norbert, is similar, right? The problems are presented to the community and people are invited to respond to those. So what sort of role do your organizations play in facilitating that, or is this driven maybe out of another initiative? Is that something that you guys actually actively drive? So George,
yeah.
Why don't you go first? Sorry.
No problem. So no, it was something that we've tried in the past. What we also realized that there needs to be a filtering mechanism where those problem statements, it's easy for the insurers to come up with, but they need to be, the commitment from them to actually go through with the solution has always been a challenge, where they, you know, we find them, let's say five different startups that can solve this problem for them. They go away and 6 months later, they're still in the discussion phase. And that's generated quite a bit of frustration obviously from the insurtech side, because the velocity is very different across the two. So what we've done is use this as a bit of a filtering mechanism to say, okay, actually out of the insurers that have come up with these problems, there's ones that are more committed to it, and there's going to be certain ones that are less committed or probably less, have a less of a velocity. So in that sense, I think that's kind of how we've facilitated this dialogue or this process to really drive the collaboration, but also in a very proactive way.
Yeah. Norbert, I think you mentioned as well, I think maybe, so but anyway, I'm sure I've heard you mention that this whole issue of speed from the incumbents is an issue in your market as well. I think that's universal, by the way. You hear that everywhere. So do you want to comment on that as well?
I can just give you an example. So Plug and Play, for example, came to Japan at the beginning of 2018. They actually started with a FinTech badge. And about 18 months later, some of the companies that were in the first batch finally made it to a POC with the corporate partners that they have. And so if you come to Japan, the difficulty, the challenge is that it will take a long time to build the relationships. The upside is always when you actually have that relationship, these are also your clients forever. It's a tight relationship, right? You can even make a mistake and you can work through that. You don't get fired as a provider immediately, but you need to have the persistence to stick it out for the first 18, 24 months. And many startups shy away from that, and many startups push Japan to a later stage. But the later you start in Japan, the later you will also generate real revenue. And so it's something that you should probably do in parallel with your rest of Asia strategy.
Mm. Okay, so we've got a couple minutes left. I've got one topic that I did want to get to, and it's come up in the question and answer as well. So I think maybe just if each of you could just take a few seconds to talk on this. How do you help organizations scale up across borders? So if somebody on this call wants to explore Southeast Asia, what's available to them to help them to try and maximize their opportunity? And that would apply equally to the other markets. So George, I started with Southeast Asia. Why don't we go there?
So the way that we've seen so far work the best is, I think it's still fairly traditional, where they reach out to us and we try to connect them to the right parties based on our experience. And this could involve both the regulators or the incumbents, or even the potential partners like the other startups that are in the complementary segments. So we know the landscape of the region fairly well, and this is where we try to work with the startups to really help them. I guess as Brenton mentioned right at the beginning, what we've also done is the road shows and more of a proactive efforts that we hope to resume after this whole COVID thing blows over, because the face-to-face element is definitely an important one for scalability.
So if anybody on this call wants to scale into any of the markets represented here, I guess you're all a great first point of contact. Jason, why don't you quickly talk, because this came from New Zealand as a question, about government programs perhaps here that can help. And I'm sure that they're available. Somebody in the chat has mentioned the Austrade landing pad, but Jason, why don't you talk about maybe the New Zealand government's initiatives to help there?
Yeah, well, we're very fortunate, really. We've got a number of channels, but just very briefly, New Zealand used to invest 2% of its GDP into technology investment. It's now 3%. So in the last 2 years, there's been a big growth in investment, and that's supported through our distribution arms. In case of New Zealand, it's Callahan, it's Ateed, and a bunch of others I won't name necessarily over here. But what you're seeing now is more engagement in terms of channel to market. So New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, for example, in Singapore, George, are very active, connecting our marketplaces to the Asian marketplaces. And indeed, this session we're doing today of a collaboration and reaching out and engaging is a very good example of the way that we do this. So we obviously have the funding side. We have, even today, we were supposed to be in the Insurtech event in Singapore, which New Zealand Trade and Enterprise and all of us on this call actually had joined together with joining. So kind of fortunate that we're here today. So there are a bunch of initiatives. There are private ones as well, and that very much relies on funding. And I won't take up time on this call, but it's a very important part of helping companies export and grow internationally.
Guys, we're out of time. I'm sorry I didn't get to each of you there, because that's such a good question, a good area to explore. But look, in summary, I think all people on this call are available and can be contacted for any further dialogue on this. We'll also put a recording out of this, I think, on the GITA YouTube channel. Is that right, Norbert?
Yes, we will.
And we will also make sure that there's something written up following this call, which hopefully might address the 1 or 2 questions that we haven't got to. I apologize that we haven't done that. An hour goes very, very quickly. So without further ado, I want to thank everybody who has attended and shown interest in this session. We hope to run more if there's a requirement for it. And I want to particularly thank the panelists who've been excellent. It's been a really, really good discussion, and have a good day, everybody. We're more than halfway through in New Zealand, but some of you are still early on. So, thanks, everyone, and yeah, have a great day. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.